Hello and welcome to the Career Success Podcast. I'm Jason Connolly. If you're a regular listener, it's great to have you back. But if you're new, welcome to the show. In this insightful and thought-provoking series, we speak to business leaders and people who have had high levels of career success. But we also talk to up-and-coming and emerging business talent. We speak to such a variety of people all across the globe. We'll talk about success habits and what they do in order to ensure they stay at the top of their game. Listen and find out hints and tips to help you in the world of business. How do you set up your own company and make sure it's a success? But also how to drive business growth. Practical advice to help you in your career from those who have made it. In this episode, I'm joined by Dan Klivner from Los Angeles. Dan is a leader at Sidley Austin, where he serves as co-head of the firm's 330 lawyer M&A and Private Equity practice. He's managing partner of the firm's Greater Los Angeles offices and is a member of the firm's executive committee. Dan's skills as an M&A lawyer and leadership is recognised at Sidley and across the legal industry. As one of the first openly gay partners at a major firm, he's been a pioneer and a role model for the LGBT community. He is a donor to and influence on many institutions that have helped bring light to important causes and issues, including diversity and inclusion, access to justice, AIDS research and treatment, and the transformative impact of culture and education. Dan, thank you so much for joining me on this episode.
Thank you for having me, Jason. That person you just described sounds very impressive.
He does indeed, and I'm so delighted that he's on the show. So thank you. Very modest of you, Dan. We've got kind of so much I want to talk to you about. You're one of the most well-recognized M&A lawyers. But before we kind of talk about that and what you've done for diversity in the LGBTQ community, can we kind of reverse in time and find out how it all kind of got started for you in the law and legal?
Sure. I was born and raised in New York City, and I was a product of the New York City public school system. And during that time, I was exposed to law and lawyering, but also to Wall Street, being a native New Yorker. And somehow I got interested in deals and deal making. And when I pursued a legal education, I was eventually drawn to corporate law and have pursued it ever since.
And why was it corporate law? Was it the kind of being involved in the business and kind of the thrill of M&As and so on, or what was it that appealed to you about that particular vertical?
It was the thrill of reading about the deals in the first instance. I didn't really know what the corporate lawyer's role was. And I think that's accurate even today for law students coming out of
Mm.
law school. It's not something you necessarily learn in law school. I was a finance major in college in the business school, and so I had some sense of deals and deal making, but not really the specific role. And I gravitated to the idea that I wanted to be a part of that no matter what my role was. And in the early days, the role was, insignificant. It was proofreading and messengering
Mm.
documents and so forth, but really embracing the idea that there was a bigger story there and one that was usually quite exciting and usually made it to the newspaper on a Monday morning after a hard weekend of work.
And what are the kind of differences between what and I guess a lot of law students have this kind of maybe misconception about what corporate law involves. What were the differences between what you thought it was and what the reality of the actual role was in itself?
Well, first and foremost, I was um, impressed with the speed. I didn't appreciate how quickly a $1 billion deal could go down. And for a law student or a young lawyer relative to, say, a litigation experience where litigation could, let's say, drag on for years, the deal making just seemed fast and provided a level of kind of instant gratification. Second, I liked the cooperative nature of it. I liked the idea that at the end of the deal, people were clinking champagne glasses and still happy to talk to each other. Some of my partners now are litigators and they say they could win the case, but the client says, I never want to see you again because that was the worst experience of my life.
Yeah.
Whereas with our clients, hopefully they and the other side are aiming to a common goal. And when that goal is achieved, at least in the first instance, people are usually pretty happy about it.
Yeah, and I guess as a corporate lawyer in itself, you know you're very fundamental to the deal making process, and I assume that there's a lot of kind of keeping a level head, and what you have to do is act as the go between. And I imagine how do you get experience in that, and how does it all kind of build up as the years go on, and I think that would really be insightful to people who are maybe beginning out in their career. I know there's a lot of people who listen to this show who are just starting out. I think that level of insight, they'd really find that helpful.
I love the way you phrased that question, Jason. I have a reputation for being a calming influence. And I can talk about how that has helped me, especially as I got more senior. In the early days, it was just about a commitment to work and a good attitude and seeing through the moment. I think
Mm,
that, and I learned it at the table of other great lawyers and mentors. I watched folks who had a cooperative style, who were some of the smartest people that I'd ever seen before, and who were able to be effective without being blowhards or confrontational. I'll
mm,
give you an example of that, Jason. I watched, and I now in my practice often do this, I watched somebody prepare for a meeting by thinking about what a solution might look like. And then in engaging with the other side, they would sit next to the lawyer for the other side, not opposite, but actually
right.
next to. And they would show them, say, a rider that had a proposed solution to a thorny problem that had been debated for a couple of rounds. And now, rather than debating whether or not to include the rider, I would watch the other lawyer start just quibbling over certain words. But the concept now had been embraced, and it was just about negotiating certain words. That style of lawyering appealed to me. I have a competitive side too, but it was about being effective and watching others do it with such grace and intelligence that really resonated. And and if I could just add one more thing. So in my own practice with younger associates, I would bring them to my table in my office back in the days when we actually had an office and had a table. And we and it was an important learning tool, but also an important way for them to learn more about their own role in the greater context of the deal by sitting in and listening to those calls and listening to those negotiations. And maybe through osmosis and training and
Mm.
development, they would do it themselves.
I think you make some really interesting points there, Dan. I never have been to university myself. My journey into recruitment and legal is a really odd one, where I worked in the police for many years. But I think communication kind of is the key and the door to a lot of things in life. But you mentioned there that you kind of got these skills and you watched other people. Do you think, because I hear this a lot, do you think that what kind of universities do and the way they train people in kind of the academic side of legal, do you think there needs to be more done to train people in these kind of soft skills? Because that is a big part of what lawyers do, and you've really highlighted that just there.
I think that's happening, but I think
Mhm,
that more needs to be done around the transactional side. Law school, at least in the US, prepares you to be an adversary. It's a Socratic method of learning, of questioning and answering and challenging. A lot of the extracurricular activities are around cross-examining witnesses
right.
or litigating. And
Mhm,
there are some schools, UCLA in particular, has a wonderful transactional curriculum. And I don't know how much time, honestly, they spend on these softer skills, communication skills in particular, like you asked about. But it is a useful education because more than almost anything else that I remember from law school, the approach to communicating with your colleagues and adversaries is critical.
that's really interesting. And when you're at kind of the absolute crunch point of some of these deals, I know that you've worked with absolutely massive companies and massive deals. What have you kind of learned over the years that's kind of absolute pivotal to the success of getting these deals through? And what's be your kind of top advice for people on how to compose yourself as a corporate lawyer and really get these things through when you're under pressure? Obviously you mentioned about your kind of calming influence, and I imagine that's a big point. But have you got any other kind of things that you've picked up over the years that have made got you to where you are?
Yeah, my approach generally follows four prongs. One, understand the client's motivation and understand the other side's motivations, understand what the goals are, follow the money. there's no substitute for preparation and for reading the document. One of my mentors, who's since passed away, used to say, turn the page. So that by reading the agreement and reading the underlying materials, you learn a lot. So
Mm.
preparation is paramount, but understanding it is key. Number two would be clarify. If you don't understand something, or if there's a position that the other side's taking that isn't quite clear to you or your client, seek to clarify with the other side what's intended. When they said, we'll never agree to that, say, do you mean never or mostly? um, I've seen lawyers use clarification to great effect. There are reasonable clarifications, and then it's the beginning process of a negotiation, and they just, go through every point, quote unquote, clarifying.
Mm.
Organize yourself. And this is at every level. Lists are invaluable, whether you use electronic help or you write it on a legal pad like the old timers. But having a list, a to-do list, a checklist, a signing checklist, a diligence checklist, a list of open points. And by the way, if you're doing that, why not have a proposed solution as well, not just raising issues? And that might be the last of the points. It's try and find ways to solve the issues, whether through argument or agreement or advocacy. But in any case, what our clients really crave are taking your personality out of it, the personal comfort. They hate to hear, oh, the other lawyer is a jerk. It's not about that.
Mm.
It's about getting to the answer. And it may be true that the other lawyer is a jerk, but they don't want to hear that. They want to hear a solution. And you got to figure out how to take yourself out of it and go back to step one, achieve the goal that had been set out. So I hope that's a helpful framework. It guides me.
I think that's really helpful. I think you make some, absolutely fantastic learning points there, which I'm sure people will pick up on. And it's, the way you kind of talk about how you process these problems and, the way you're giving solutions and stripping out the personality. I think, it's absolutely fascinating to hear. I can imagine you've been in many, many, many stressful situations in your role and try to solve, highly complex solutions. So you co-head up the firm's 330 lawyer M&A and private equity practice. Tell us about how you've kind of risen the ranks to that position and what your kind of day-to-day looks like. It's a lot of people to manage, and I can imagine it's highly complex. There's a lot of moving parts at any one time. What's your kind of way of leading people and so forth?
I rose up really at the request of others. It's not something that you can campaign for or run for.
Mhm.
Um, in each of I've only been to two firms, both terrific law firms, but in each case, someone asked me if I would step up to some additional responsibility, and I embraced it, and I tried, and I said yes, and I tried. My management style is honestly about elevating others. It's recruiting, mentoring, promoting extraordinary talent that is smarter than me,
Mm.
and finding out ways in which I can support them, whether it's through some administrative thing or some money for a client development or helping them answer a question or thinking through a problem. So I ask, what do you need to support your practice, to support your clients, and frankly for yourself, especially in this pandemic era. You say we have 330 lawyers in my practice group and 330 different situations and stories relating
Mm.
to this global pandemic. And so finding ways to support them both professionally and frankly personally has been a core value of mine. And maybe a related point is then connecting. My tool that I like the best in a big institution is to find ways to connect people that otherwise might not have even known each other. When I
Mm.
hear you start talking about the way you got into this, it reminds me of somebody else's story. And I'll say, you really should meet that person. Or,
Yeah.
you tell me about, by the way, yours is the most amazing podcast, and I'm really grateful to be on here. But you,
Oh, thank
you know,
you.
immediately comes to mind like, oh, you know who else you should interview, Jason? And I'll talk to you about that.
Oh,
And
well, I'm so
and
excited already, Dan. Thank you so much. It's,
but
do you know what? The stories I've heard, Dan, on this podcast, it's opened my eye, it's opened my world, and it's such a privilege to be able to have the time to talk to people like yourself who've got such an interesting story. So thank you.
but that's been my style. It's to hear
Mm.
something from a client and say, "Oh, I have a vendor that you should really be talking to." And I'm pretty loyal and pretty well connected, it turns out, and I enjoy using that to elevate those other partners, associates, and colleagues.
Hearing you talk is just so refreshing because I've been in the legal recruitment industry now for a decade, and I've been around the block enough times. And to hear, a firm of your size using things about listening to people, connecting with people, hearing their individual stories where everyone is a person, it's so refreshing. And I know, when I was kind of doing some research into yourself, Sidley has supported you during, some challenging times as well, and the firm's been there for you. I know one of the particular challenges that you've had, which I hope you don't mind me kind of bringing up and talking about, is you joined Sidley in 2015, just when your husband at that time was diagnosed with cancer. And what a challenging time to even start a new role. But the firm was even there for you during that time, and I know they were particularly supportive. I don't know if you can sort of talk to us about that particular challenge and how I'm sure there's many people out there who are having tough times right now.
Well, you've done your research, Jason, and you've given me chills. It brings me back to a very special time in my life not so long ago, and I'm happy to talk about it. I'll tell you just
Thank
a
you.
little story. Um,
Go ahead.
I joined Sidley in 2015, and
Mhm.
it was after a 25 plus year career at Simpson Thatcher, a very fine Wall Street law firm, where I headed the Los Angeles office. But I had plateaued in terms of what I could continue to do at Simpson Thatcher in LA.
Mm.
And Sidley came calling, looking for my form of leadership in M&A, private equity, media, and entertainment in Los Angeles, where we had 150 lawyers already and were there for 35 years. And Stephen very much encouraged me to make the move. Honestly, I was so happy at my former firm that
Mm.
I didn't imagine moving. But Stephen said, go where you're celebrated. And that was a guiding light, a North Star. Go where you're going to be
Mm.
celebrated in Los Angeles with respect to your clients and your practice. And so I moved. And shortly thereafter, his illness took a turn for the worse. And he was going through chemo. And at this point, I'm at Sidley. I'm only
Mm.
at Sidley less than a year, and I'm on a business trip to London. And he's losing his hair. And I'll admit to some drinking involved, but I said,
Mm.
I really should probably shave my head in support. And four partners from Sidley who knew me less than a year said, if you do it, we'll do it. And the head
Wow.
of the London office, the head administrative person, another partner in London, and a partner, friend from Chicago in M&A, who leads the M&A group in Chicago, all went to the barbers and we shaved our head. And you can
Wow.
imagine the tears when I returned with this
Mm.
picture. That's a level of camaraderie, of support,
Mm.
of just what a cool thing.
Mm.
And you'll do a lot for people who will show that kind of empathy, not only to you but to your loved ones. And I tell that story just to show the heart and the soul. It's not just lawyers being lawyers. Sometimes they're really people first
Yeah.
and friends.
Yeah. Well, it is that story's just made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. So, what a heartwarming story to tell, and that solidarity of people standing by you.
Wait, let me just add one thing, please.
Yes.
The
Go ahead.
important thing that I learned in that experience was, and we're going to talk about LGBT issues and being in the closet. I learned
Mm.
that I couldn't keep it in the closet. That there was just this other thing in my life that was so important, dealing with Stephen's illness. And I was going to deal with it while working. And I think I managed both well, but that some of the calls I was going to take were going to be from a doctor's office or a hospital. And so I used all the tools in my toolkit: good humor, transparency, genuine compassion, and obviously relied on the support that I received from Sidley. But I couldn't have done it alone. That was the lesson of my life, was that I had to be a little vulnerable. I had to share. I had to reach out to others and share with them what I was going through, and then count on them to support me. If I had tried to do this, and you see celebrities who
Mm.
are remarkable, and that's their decision, that they're not going to tell anyone and they're going to go through these battles alone. I couldn't do it that way, and I needed to share, and I was rewarded in
Mm.
kind for that level of transparency.
And I think that's a good listen to other people. I think if you were going through that alone, people wouldn't have known what was going on in your world at that time. And
Yep.
what a sad story, but also what a story of the firm and how people have supported you during that time. So thank you for sharing that, Dan. Kind of moving to what you just mentioned there, LGBT. I am gay myself. I've had various, different experiences of coming out. I feel like I've come out many, 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 many times now. I came, I,
I
you
can
know,
relate. I can relate.
yeah, I was in the police, and that's a whole nother story. Coming coming out there, you'd think would be easy, but actually, that was the hardest place of anywhere. Tell us a bit about you, kind of coming out, being one of the first openly gay partners at a major law firm. That's a monumentous moment in itself, and to be a pioneer and a role model. I've got so many notes about what you've done. I can't even begin to even start reading them all out about what you've actually done for the LGBT community. It goes on and it goes on, and I really think you should have that platform here to sort of talk to us about that and talk to the people who listen to the show about just what you've done and your experiences.
Thank you. You're very kind. I think well, I'll tell you a little bit about the beginning. I was totally
Mm.
closeted. It's fascinating to hear you say all that I've done for the LGBT community because I don't see
I've
it
got
that
it all
way.
here, Dan. It's
Okay.
right in front of me.
Well,
Go ahead.
I was closeted for the longest time and secretive. And you could have been introducing yourself as you did, Jason, a moment ago and said, I'm a gay man. And I wouldn't have
Mm.
told you that I am. It was not about support or acceptance. It was about me wanting to keep that private side of my life very private. And at that time, I wanted to just be known as, the best professional at every level, college and in law school. I was closeted, and everybody wanted to introduce me to their sister or their other, their roommate's friend or whatever. And I wasn't having any of it. I had a lot of
Was that only
excuses.
fueling you on, like a kind of spiral of lies to kind of, a spider web of wanting to kind of, go along with that more because as it went on, the kind of lie got bigger, or?
Well, you know what? I try not to lie too much. The only thing I used to lie about was the gender.
Mm.
You know,
Right.
I
Yep.
would say,
Yep.
"Oh, I'm already dating," period,
Right.
without
Okay.
gender
Yep.
neutral. Or
Mm.
I would say, eventually I would say things like, "I went to we went to the theater," but I wouldn't say
Mm.
exactly with whom. Or if I lied, I would say with a girlfriend instead,
Mm. Mm.
and
Mm.
that was the lie. But the rest
You
of
did
it,
gender neutral terms.
I did. I tried,
Mm.
but eventually I became a lawyer and a lawyer at the firm. But I was single, and years into my career, they asked me to move to Los Angeles. And I had lived in Tokyo for 2.5 years because I had done a deal for Panasonic, then known as
Mm.
Matsushita, acquiring Universal Studios. And in the aftermath of that deal, the firm asked me if I'd move to Tokyo. And I was fascinated in that opportunity, and I did it. I was already together with Stephen at that time. Stephen and I were together 29 years, the entirety of my adult professional life. But at that time, just a year. And
Mm.
so we were separated for a year and a half, and nobody knew it. Nobody understood that I had a relationship, a long distance relationship. Anyway, I returned to New York, and then they asked me if, since I had succeeded, I guess, in Tokyo, whether I would then move to LA to open an office to service Universal Studios. And the clincher was, it's easy for you to do because you're single. And at that point, I was confronted with this need
Mm.
really to tell someone at the firm that it wasn't so easy and that I had already been apart for a year and a half of my relationship and that you're asking me again to separate, and you that are asking need to understand what you're really asking. And so I came out to a few wonderfully supportive partners at that firm before I even came out to my parents. And they, as I say, I remember the specific conversation. He closed the door and turned it immediately to, "Are you okay? Like, how have you been treated here? Has anybody said anything inappropriate or bad?" And I said, "No, no, it's all been fine. It's just that it was on me not to share it." And then he introduced me immediately to a number of other people who would have been very friendly to the LGBT community, one whose sister was gay and who I remain dear friends with even after his retirement. Another one whose brother in law was gay and had a relationship. The point is, and then finally to another one who said, let me start introducing you to guys. And in all those cases, I wouldn't have even known their stories, but for my own coming out. And
Did the
that was
reaction
the
at the
beginning of
time,
it.
did it take you by surprise, Dan? Was you expecting the kind of reception to be in that way, or?
It did. It did because it just, look, this is going back to 1996. It was a different time. not a terrible time. It just wasn't as openly discussed, and I'm going to use the word normal and accepted as it is today to be in the LGBTQ community. There
Mm,
were today the law schools have affinity groups, the
yeah.
law firms have affinity groups. We do routinely recruit folks specifically in the LGBT community, just as in other affinity groups. And it's a very different, we have gay marriage in the United States and in many countries in the world. Recall that Ellen DeGeneres was fired for coming out on a national,
Mm,
she was fired from her television show because she came out as gay. So it's a very different time. And yet they were enormously warm and supportive. And so that did catch me a little bit by surprise. And as I say, so I did go to LA and eventually, like you, started to come out to a number of different people. It feels like many coming out stories. And I'll tell you the best story I've heard more recently. It just shows you the difference. A friend told me that he asked his grandson if he had a girlfriend in elementary school, and the kid said, "Dad, Gramps, I don't have a girlfriend. I have a boyfriend."
right.
And the grandfather said, "Tell me about him." And I said, you saved that kid years of counseling
Yeah.
just by
Well,
that level of acceptance and not having to tell the
mm,
story and just, okay, if it's, it's the boyfriend, tell me about him.
what an anecdotal story. Because you've throughout the years, and you've helped to bring light to, as I said in the introduction, important causes and issues, diversity and inclusion, access to justice, AIDS research and treatment, the transformative impact of culture and education. How have you? Obviously, you've mentioned there that there's been a lot of changes over that time. Has it seemed quite slow and gradual to you, or has it kind of really, bolted forward in the last few years, or how has it seemed to you, kind of going through that period of bringing light to all these causes? Has it, to talk us through how it's felt for you?
My own impression is that in the arc of history, it's been really quick. The women's suffragette movement was 100 years ago, and today we're inaugurating the first female vice president in the United States in history. It took 100 years from giving women the vote
Mm,
to electing a woman vice president. We had social unrest in the summer around systemic racism and racial injustice. That's 100 years in the making, and 50
mm,
years since the race riots in the 60s. And yet
yeah.
there's still so much more work to be done. I think there's been great strides, but there's so much more to be done. And I never would have imagined that you would have gay marriage in a period of really 20 years advocacy, back to when they were arresting people in New York City and major cities around the world for being gay. So coming from that to gay marriage and acceptance, I think has been relatively quick, not easy. And it took a three-part strategy, and I commend the leaders of that. I supported it in the sense of writing some checks and trying to be a good example. And that was one
Mm,
tier of the strategy, I think, was just beginning to have folks, acknowledge that they themselves were gay, so that when people realized that it was their own doctor or lawyer or dentist or
mm,
son or
mm.
daughter, it changed the narrative, at least in that family. You can be
Yeah.
vitriolic and hateful until you find out it's your daughter you're talking about. And
I,
similarly, so prong one was just socializing the issue. Number two was a legislative approach, and number three was through policy, and number three was litigation, including ultimately to the Supreme Court. And I'm proud that we had some small role to play in that.
mm,
I'm a member of the Williams Institute Legal Counsel at UCLA Law, and that institute is a leading US research center on sexual orientation and gender identity law and public policy. And we helped write an amicus brief for the Supreme Court in connection with the gay marriage cases, which including one which was cited. So I'm pretty proud of that. But it's a very small
wow.
connection. There were other people really at the
Mm.
vanguard and at the forefront. I'll tell you a funny uh,
Oh,
uh,
please do.
anecdote. Um, when I started, as we discussed, I was completely
Yeah.
secretive and closeted. A couple of years ago, I was honored to be nominated by Chambers, a publication,
I know it.
as one of the leading gay lawyers in the US. And a friend of mine at that time said, look how far we've come from being in the closet to running for Gay Lawyer of the Year. And I said, I'm not running for Gay Lawyer of the Year. And by the way, I didn't win. Um, but uh, uh, but yeah, that's how far we've come.
And the way you describe, I've never heard anyone describe it like that. The way you mentioned about the suffragettes and where we've kind of come in that time, it's true, but I've never heard anyone sum it up like that. And it's absolutely great. And I know that you're an extremely modest person, Dan, but to have people like you who are leaders out there in massive businesses talking openly about subjects like this, and for all you've done for the community, me being part of the LGBTQ family, I commend you. Thank you for all you've done. And I'm sure many other people will do as well. And it's a really nice anecdote to hear that story.
Jason, that's why I tell the story. That's why I allowed
Mm,
myself to be a little more vulnerable and a little more transparent in the hopes that someone listening to this or hearing my
mm,
story or seeing me at an event will feel a little more empowered, a little more emboldened to be themselves. I never really was, as I say, at the front lines waving the flag, but just
yeah,
through example, it changed the lives of my colleagues. And you know what? It made my straight colleagues much better allies
yeah,
for them for in the telling they learned that they wanted to be supportive too, and that like I said, the first person I told said, oh my goodness, have we said anything wrong or bad, you know immediately wanting to improve their own language and learn a little bit more about the challenges that somebody else was facing. And it's only in the telling that you're able to
and
find
there is going to be people out there who I'm sure find this, really helpful to hear your story, what you've been through, your experiences, and it is going to empower people. It will. Kind of, I could talk to you, Dan, for hours about all things, but
I
I'm
have a
very
meeting.
conscious. Yes, yeah,
I'm a
yeah,
busy lawyer. I'm a busy
exactly. Just as we kind of close this conversation, and
Sure.
it's been absolutely insightful. What advice would you maybe give to a lawyer now that might be newly qualified, 1, 2, 3 years experience, who's thinking, I want to strive to become a partner. I want to be where Dan is today. What advice would you give to someone who's maybe more junior in their career on how they can climb the career ladder as such?
The advice I would give to someone starting out is to think exactly the way you said it, to think long term. Like, what would it take for me to be a partner? What if I imagined that I wanted to be a partner instead of starting with a foot out the door by saying, I only intend to do this 3 years? The truth is, most of us only intended to do it for 3 years.
Yeah.
And you keep going. It's interesting and challenging. But if you started with the mindset that I want to be the best I can be, I want to
Mm.
achieve some level of success. What do I need to do to achieve it? You'd embrace the job more fully than if you thought you were exiting. And as to embracing the job more fully, I think you look beyond the moment. We all want to start and be the kingmaker and the deal maker, but there's an apprenticeship. And
Mm.
doing your role as well as it can be done is an important key, and having the attitude that others want to be a part of. The next point is that attitude counts for a lot, and that if
Mm.
you embrace the challenges but also find some humor and be a decent and good person and a good colleague, then people will want to work with you, and they'll forgive the inexperience and they'll forgive the mistakes
Yeah.
because they'll understand that your heart is in the right place and that you're a good person. And then the last thing I would say about a tip for success for the early for someone early in their career is be true to yourself. It's a lot of what we talked about. You've achieved whatever level of success you have to that point by being yourself, and it's worked for you. Don't change. Find ways to use your personality and your skills and your life story to motivate others and to connect with others, because in the long run it'll be rewarded.
What absolutely beautiful advice, Dan, and what a great way to finish the show on. I want to say a big, sincere thanks for taking the time to share your experiences, share your story, and to talk to us. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Dan.
My pleasure, Jason.
That was Dan Klivner from Los Angeles in America, co head of Sidley's corporate practice. I'm Jason Connolly. This is the Career Success Podcast. Until next time, goodbye.